Hi guys, we're going to work on poetry explication today. So in your canvas, I have made you this handy dandy poetry explication handout. That's my ceiling fan blowing. So it says poetry explication. What explication means is to take apart and kind of explain it and then put it back together. It's a way to analyze poetry or anything really. You can take anything apart to its parts. You can do a story, you can do a film, novel, any kind of fiction as well. So a poetry explication, I tried to narrow it down to 10 things. So the first one is theme, main idea, lesson, moral, what you're supposed to take away or get from the poem. Second one is the speaker, and I've given you some questions there. Who is it? Is it a specific gender? Are they speaking in a persona? Are there multiple speakers? Is it just a monologue, one person? Is it a dialogue like My Last Duchess and two people talking back and forth? Maybe you have multiple speakers, maybe you have more than two. So that's one of your jobs to figure out. 3, paraphrase, and that's to summarize briefly by stanza. If the poem is only one stanza, it's up to you to kind of break it apart into chunks that you think are manageable. 4, tone, and I have there the speaker's attitude. Easy example for tone, if my son Brady gets a haircut that I don't like, and I'm like, oh, Brady, nice haircut. So obviously my tone is sarcastic, but the words nice haircut mean the opposite. So the tone is super important because it has the ability to change the meaning of the words. Mood, I have atmosphere, feeling, it's more general. Poe, you probably did him, plays a lot with mood. It's dark, it's melancholy. You have people that are insane or who have experienced traumatic events, and it is always very dark. So he also uses his word choice to get that across. Like, you're not gonna go for a picnic by the lake, you're going to bury a dead body by the tarn. So tarn is an old, kind of not very attractive word for lake, but he's gonna use that word choice to kind of connect with his theme and mood. Rhythm, cadence and beat. If you've played a musical instrument or if you like music, this is gonna be easier for you, but that's okay, we're gonna work it out. Meter, number of syllables per line, is there a pattern? And does the syntax, so syntax just means word order, does that matter? Is he playing with word order or mixing things up that sound a little different, maybe to make rhyme scheme? Maybe he's using a shorter word or a contraction to make meter. Like a lot of times back in the day, instead of over, since that would be 2 syllables, over, they would use or, so they would do O and then apostrophe and then ER, so or, so they'd take out that V to make it 1 syllable instead of 2. So look for that. That's kind of your job as the explicator to find those things. So with rhythm, I'm not going to require a scansion. A scansion is when you have to identify not just the rhythm and the meter, but the unaccented and accented syllables. If you read Shakespeare before, we'll go way back, Romeo and Juliet. So probably like 9th or 10th grade of high school. When you had Romeo and Juliet, part of how meter is how words are pronounced. So if we're in New York and we're watching Romeo and Juliet, maybe Juliet is from the Bronx. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? So she's gonna have Romeo as 3 syllables. So that is going to mess with the meter because Shakespeare is from Stratford-on-Avon, not the Bronx. So his syllables would be Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? So now he's at 10 syllables instead of like 12-ish, 13 when we messed with Romeo. So that's gonna take away the pattern. Let's look at the next lines. Deny thy father and refuse thy name, and if thou wilt be but so worn, my love, I will So we can see that all 4 of those lines have 10 syllables each. Now we're looking at a rhythmic pattern. For him, if we were scanning it, it would be unaccented, accented. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? So that he's punching each, that's called an iamb, unaccented, accented. And the iamb itself is unaccented, accented, how you say it, I am. So that's handy, whoever did that. So that's iambic pentameter because we have 10 syllables. Meter in poetry also means feet. So if you have 10 syllables, if you have 10 kind of syllables to count on your fingers like we did, an iamb is a metrical foot. So if we have 5 iambs, we have 10 syllables because it's unaccented, accented. So each accent, each iamb is 2 syllables. So iambic pentameter would just mean penta, 5, meter, feet, so 5 feet of iambs. We're not going to necessarily get that specific, maybe in 1B, maybe in 24A, but for English 1A, if you see it, cool, but we're gonna kind of go beyond, and we will find it, and we'll work on some together in 1B and 24A and 48 as well, and 1C if you want to look at poetry, it'll be very similar. Okay, type of poem. What is the form? Is it a sonnet? A sonnet, we know, always has 14 lines only, no more, no less, unless somebody's messing with form. So a sonnet will have, there are tons of different types of sonnets, Petrarchan, Shakespearean, Elizabethan, Italian. So that there are different people who did different rhyme schemes that have different types of sonnets. So we'll get more into that as we go. A lyric should be your go-to. A lyric is any poem that elicits emotion, so bonus. How many stanzas does it have? Again, that is your job to break it down. You have certain people, Emily Dickinson loves a quatrain, 4-line stanza. William Blake loves a 4-line quatrain. So that you'll count up the number of stanzas and you'll see if there's a pattern to how many lines in each stanza. And maybe you have 4 stanzas and 3 of them have 4 lines, but 1 of them doesn't. So now you have to go, why are they breaking that pattern? Kind of what's the point there? You will learn lots of different types of poems. It depends on how much time we're spending on it. If you're in 24A, you will have midterm and final that gives you different types to know. So we'll be going over those as they come. So again, your other job there is to find a pattern. If there's no pattern, that's something interesting to talk about too. Why do you think the poet chose to have no pattern? Rhyme scheme. First thing we'll be looking at in rhyme scheme is the end rhyme. So anything at the very end of the line that either rhymes or doesn't. If you have a couplet, the large cat sat on the mat. Hello, check. So that we will have the large cat, so the end of the line is cat, sat on the mat. Hello, we have mat at the end too. But then your next job is internal rhyme. And since sat on the mat, hello, now we have something that rhymes within the line. So internal rhyme just means rhyme within the line. End rhyme means rhyme the very last word. Within this, I've given you a couple of other items. Is there a pattern? And if there is a pattern, it's your job to find what it is. And we do that with letters. If you have a rhyme, so if we were going to do our little poem, the large cat sat on the mat, that would be a couplet. And since cat and mat rhyme, we'd give them the same letter, which would be A. If you're looking at some of the older authors that they do more with rhyme than other people, I'm going to show you an example who doesn't do a lot of rhyme, but sometimes it might rhyme even if it's not exact. and that is called a half or a slant rhyme, and we will look for those too. So you're just looking for the scheme, and anything that has a similar line rhyme, you're going to give that the same letter, like we did with the cat and the mat. If our poem continued, the cat looked at the bird, silence was all he heard as the bird flew away. So bird and herd rhyme, so now we'd have A, B, B, and then flew away. Doesn't rhyme with either one of them, so we'd give that a C because it's a new sound. That's how easy rhyme scheme is. Okay, diction, number 9. Super just as important. You notice there's a lot of items to look at in diction. So the first thing to look at in diction is word choice. Is it formal? Like we did with Shakespeare. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Very formal. Maybe it's not formal. Hey dude, what's up? And so the diction is very different in that way. Sometimes diction can read masculine or feminine, depending on suffixes, depending on word choice, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. Figurative language, I put a little asterisk, that when you're looking at figurative language, also look at punctuation. Emily Dickinson had her dashes. Some people really like ellipses to do those 3 dots. Hey, there's something missing, there's something coming up. So look for question marks, look for exclamation marks. So does he only use an exclamation mark one time? Or are there extra spaces between words? Are random things capitalized that normally in regular grammar wouldn't be capitalized? You are also looking for the big kahunas. So simile, comparison using like or as, metaphor, comparison using a form of to be, alliteration, repeated consonant sounds, big baby buggy bumper. Simile, love is like a rose. A metaphor would be love is a rose. Same idea, but with a form of the word to be instead of like or as. Assonance, repeated vowel sounds, how now, brown cow. So the same kind of, whether it's a short vowel sound or a long vowel sound or kind of a diphthong, 2 different vowels moved together. Onomatopoeia, sound words, clack, bang, zap. Poe loved onomatopoeia with the bells. Imagery, creating a word picture, and allusions, reference to something. I gave you the big 5. Myth, literature, religion, culture, or history. There can be references to other things, pieces of art, music groups and culture, which I'll show you an example of. But all those things, it's your job as the explicator, the person who's explaining, to find those. Personification, where inanimate objects are given human characteristics, like the violin cried. So we know a violin can't really cry tears, but we could imagine some sad, weepy music coming out if that's the word choice. Symbol, something physical that represents something else. And people can be symbols too, but usually we're going for inanimate objects first. We have our flag that's a symbol of our independence and patriotism. You know, you can go wherever you want. Then the last thing you do, number 10, is you're explaining, showing, connecting, analyzing how all these different parts work together to make the poem into what you think it is. Because you're going to be, at some point, proving your interpretation. Hold on to this because it will come in very handy. We will use it multiple times. I'm going to take you through the process with Breaking Tradition, a lovely poem by a lady named Janice Mirakatani, and I will put it in Canvas if you want to print it out. I put the PDF with my highlights and questions, not to be annoying, but to kind of just guide you if maybe this is your first explication, if it's your 27th explication and you're like, Carwell, I don't need that, I'm good, cool, you don't have to print it out or look at it. So Breaking Tradition, sometimes theme isn't kind of obvious right away. So you can put theme on the back burner and make sure what I do for Explication is I read through once. Just read it and kind of let it sink in. The second thing I do is read with a pen in my hand or pencil, whatever works for you. I like multiple colors, obviously. And I kind of ask myself questions of what's important. For speaker, she helps us with speaker pretty easily. She says here, after the title, Breaking Traditions, she says, for my daughter. So we're like, And we know from our little blurb about a bio that Janice Mirikitani is female. So we have the perspective of a mom. We're gonna read a little bit later, and she talks about her mom as well. So now we find out that maybe she's writing from, it's one speaker, it's Janice Mirikitani, it's the mom who's speaking, but she's also writing from the perspective of a daughter, because she writes about her mom, and she writes from the perspective of a mom for her own daughter. So kind of interesting that it's still one speaker, Janice Mirikitani, the poet, but her perspective or persona that she's speaking from is both a mom and a daughter. So I have a tendency to jump to the math first to find if the rhythm. One of the things here is your job is to show how all these parts work together. So you can jump around in your explication, you can go in order. For me, I try to find out if there's a pattern first. So my daughter denies she is like me, 9. Her secretive eyes avoid mine, 8. She reveals the hatreds of womanhood, 10. Already veiled behind music and smoke and telephones, 14. So now we're kind of all over the place. I'm not done. Then she goes to 7, this room we lock ourselves in, where whispers live like fungus, giggles about small breasts and cellulite. So far, we have what I would call a mixed meter between 7 and 14 syllables. I'd have to keep going to find out if there's some other pattern that I'm missing or if she adds, but then I have to go down here because this line, break tradition, is only 4 syllables. So I'm like, okay, revise that her smallest kind of syllable line is 4, so now I'd have to revise my mixed meter a lot. So yes, start here, but you're gonna have to go through the whole poem to see if there's something you missed. Okay, the other thing I want you to look at, I circled right here. So she starts in I, which is first person, then she goes to plural, we, and so first she's speaking as a mom and a daughter, and then she changes this room we lock ourselves in. So then she kind of moves her perspective to women. Kind of interesting, but again, that's our job as the reader to kind of go, okay, what's she doing? There's a shift. I have to kind of give my person who I'm helping a heads up. This room we lock ourselves in where whispers live like fungus. So one, you always have to do diction and figurative language. It's a poem, that's what it's made of. So with that, I already see, I want to tell her about the empty room of myself. And since that has no like or as, I know that's a metaphor that she's comparing herself to an empty room. That's a pretty big deal if you're trying, so you have to figure out as the explicator, how is she like an empty room? Why is she like an empty room? You know, what else do we usually have in a room? Furniture, things, mementos, things that are important to us, but she sees herself as an empty room. So that's kind of interesting. Next thing, she talks about where whispers live like fungus. And we know that's a simile because she's comparing whispers to fungus. So now we have to think about how does that make sense? Funguses grow, they can spread, people tell secrets. So we're getting kind of insight into what she's talking about. And then she's talking about cellulite, breasts, jealousies, menstruation, waiting rooms, hospitals, forceps, kitchens, ironing boards. So very female word choice, which would be diction. So that's going to be something to put in our explication. Then notice here, I want to show you, that she breaks out of the margin. That usually in poetry, when we want to start a new paragraph or stanza, we would indent. So, or we would leave space and just start a complete new stanza. She does neither, but she breaks the margin. You see, she does it here, she does it here again, she does it here, and she does it here. So I think it's interesting that her title is Breaking Tradition. She has break tradition capitalized down here. Normally we wouldn't capitalize tradition. She has it with a period as a complete sentence, like break tradition. We're still good. She has a subject and an object, so it's a complete sentence. But the fact that she is breaking into the margin and breaking tradition in a new way is kind of fascinating. So, and you don't have to do that as a poet if you're writing like, hey, I'm gonna do something really tricky and interesting. But, you know, it doesn't, as long as your people are noticing like, hey, she's doing something interesting there, it can be kind of useful. And so she seems to do it instead of stanza breaks or indents, so I think it's something that's worth talking about. Okay, tone and mood. That's for you to interpret. I would say some people have said she seems a little bitter, or she seems a little sad, or frustrated that women are seen as these kind of second-class citizens here, and she says guilt is passed on in our bones. With that, you could make a case for a metaphor, you could make a case for personification, because guilt is something that's intangible, but they're giving it human characteristics kind of with the DNA. So I'd really take metaphor or personification, either one on that. You can make a case. When you're talking about, when you're looking at diction, also look for alliteration. The lies that we are small and powerless, that our possibilities must be compressed to the size of pearls, displayed only as passive chokers, charms around our necks. So in poetry, that's called mouthfeel, like all the work your mouth, your tongue, your teeth have to do to get the words out and how they sound and feel in your mouth. So this idea, the repetition of the S, the repetition of the P, powerless, possibilities, compressed. So you got the C, chokers, charms, compressed, you have the pearls, and you have the S. That S is so popular. Sammy the snake slithered sideways. That's called sibilance. It has its own realm of alliteration, like its own zone. So that anytime there's something that's really interesting, and the idea that possibilities are compressed, that as females, and she's talking about, she's taking it her culture to consideration, the fact that she had to obey and be wrapped in an obi, which is a belt, so kind of a kimono situation, like wrapped up, cinched, and then she talks about like a pearl choker, that it's something that's lovely and beautiful, and it's supposed to, women are supposed to be attractive, but that's choking her, that she has these limited possibilities, the size of pearls instead of giant possibilities. So continue, notice her imagery, the music of yellow guitars, lovely. We have a symbol, this room of open window where daring ones escape. So when she's using the room of myself, the empty room, the room is neat with silence, that's called an extended metaphor. When you bring it up multiple times, you're trying to extend it out. You're trying to like elongate and kind of come back to what you're talking about. Nice symbol with the open window. Before, she didn't really talk about a window in the room, and now she's like, hey, maybe there's an escape. Maybe my daughter, after realizing my experience and her grandma's experience, maybe she can break out. And she denies that she's like me. Her secretive eyes are walls of smoke, nice metaphor, and music and telephones. So then she talks about salsa, Tina Marie, and the Stones. So that would be an allusion, so to people in the music industry, so Rolling Stones there and Tina Marie. She mirrors my aging, she is breaking tradition. So nice end repetition, and again, now we have a different point of view, separate from the I and the we that we talked about earlier. Now she's going to kind of a third person, still the mom, but looking from a different angle, like, hey, she is doing it. So here, you'd have to figure out your mood. How does it make you feel? What's the feeling that you get? We talked about the darkness of Edgar Allan Poe. So here, you'd go back to your explication. Rhyme scheme, we'd have to look at end rhyme first. So, me, mine, womanhood, telephones, myself, in, fungus, cellulite, jealousies, menstruation, hands, clamps, kitchens. We have no real rhyme. So there is not a scheme. There might be some close ones, powerless, compressed, hello. So here's a couplet, like a random couplet, line 26 and 27 or whatever. And that's the other thing, when you're explicating, make sure you can identify what it is, simile, metaphor, frustrated tone, thoughtful, reflective mood, whatever you think it is. So identify it first, then you have to quote it. Guilt passed on in our bones. I'd say that's a metaphor or personification, depending on your opinion. Guilt passed on in our bones. So line 20, 21, 22, so I'd have to quote that. Guilt passed down in our bones, in quotes, line 20. Then I'd have to explain it. Why guilt passed on in our bones? Why do I feel that's a metaphor or personification, whichever one you kind of choose that you think that you could best support. Then you'll have to do that for the whole poem. So you have to do it in parts. You might argue the tone, you might argue the mood. If you're gonna do an explication essay later, which depending on the class you're watching this for, that you will, then you're gonna have to figure out which of these elements are most important. Just a heads up, you will always have to do theme, you will always have to do diction and figurative language because they're your big kahunas. But maybe you'll have another paragraph on speaker, tone, and mood, and you put those together because they're connected. Maybe you're looking at figurative language, but you're like, ugh, maybe she's not using rhyme on purpose because she's talking about breaking tradition, so she doesn't want to rhyme like typical older poems. She's doing free verse instead because to help us illustrate her theme of breaking tradition. So those are things you'd talk about in that part 10, how all those things work together. And again, this is your opinion. I'm not going to tell you how to feel about a poem, what you think a poem means. I want to give you the freedom to interpret that for yourself and then just be able to take examples from the text and use your analysis to prove whatever your interpretation is. I think that's much more valid than me or somebody else telling you what they think it means. It's up to you. That's the beauty of poetry, to be able to interpret. So when you're kind of starting out explicating, go in whatever order you want. Know that you have to do all these jobs at some point and kind of figure out when they're giving you clues. And so ask yourself questions. I wrote a list out here. I'm trying to find, if there's a word you don't know, look it up. If there's something that you don't understand, see if you can do some research on the author. That might give you some insight. So there are many elements to choose from, and when you're going to explicate your own poem, of course do it how you want, but also make it important to you. Choose a poem that you really like, that you find is interesting. And then the assignments will vary by class. All right, thanks everybody, have a good day.